The situation has escalated beyond our projections. We must act now, mobilize all available resources.
The translator broke on the third day of negotiations. Not the machine, the concept. Ambassador Dara Osai had been sitting across from the Velkari delegation for 72 hours trying to explain what the word loss meant to a species that did not grieve. The Velkari had no mourning rituals, no burial ceremonies, no concept of a life having weight beyond its function. When their people died, they were recorded in a database and the entry was closed. Clean, efficient, final. They could not understand why the humans kept returning to the names of the dead during every session. Why those names kept appearing in documents, in speeches, in the quiet moments when human delegates would stop mid-sentence and look at nothing for a second before continuing. The lead Velkari negotiator was named Orath 7, not because there were 7 of him, because he was the 7th Orath to hold his position. His predecessors were database entries now. He did not find this sad. He found the human habit of finding it sad to be the most confusing thing about them. The summit had been called to address a border situation that had been escalating for 8 months. Human mining operations in the outer Kessel Band had encountered Velkari automated defense grids that had not appeared on any Concord-registered map. 4 human survey vessels had been destroyed. 31 people dead. The Velkari position was that the defense grids were legal under a subclause of a treaty signed before humans had achieved interstellar travel. The human position was that 31 people were dead, and the Velkari had known the grids were there, and had not warned anyone. The Concord had sent both parties to the negotiating table on a station called Meridian Point, neutral ground, climate-controlled, staffed by Dulari mediators who were very good at keeping opposite sides in the same room. Dara had been chosen for this because she was patient. That was what her file said, patient and precise. She had spent 20 years in diplomatic work across 4 species, and she had never raised her voice in a formal session. She believed, in the practical working way that some people believe things, that most conflicts were made worse by the way they were talked about, and that if you changed the language you could sometimes change the outcome. She had been trying to change the language with the Velkari for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, she arrived at the session room and found a message on the secure channel reserved for emergencies. She read it before she sat down. She read it standing at the window that looked out over the station's observation deck, where a slow arc of stars turned against the dark. The message was from Concord Monitoring. Overnight, Velkari automated systems in the Kessel Band had activated a second layer of defense grids, ones that extended directly into registered human transit lanes. 2 passenger transports had attempted to reroute and had been caught in the outer field. One had made it out, one had not. The message included a passenger manifest. Dara stood at the window for a while. Outside, the stars continued their slow turn. They did not have any opinion about what had just happened. She folded the message, put it in her jacket pocket, and walked into the session room. Orath 7 was already present with his 4-person delegation, seated with the perfect stillness that Velkari always had, like furniture that happened to breathe. He noted Dara's entry. He noted that she had not brought her usual documents. He noted that her 2 aides were not with her. She sat down across from him, just her and him on opposite sides of the table. She said, "How many people were on the transit manifest you received this morning?" Orath 7 was quiet for a moment. The Velkari did not lie as a rule. They did not see the strategic value in it. 209, he said. And your defense grid destroyed the vessel. The vessel entered a restricted zone. The zone was not registered. It was not mapped. It was not communicated to any transit authority. She was not raising her voice. She was speaking the way a person speaks when they have stopped trying to persuade and started simply statting. 209 people are dead because your government placed weapons in unmarked space and did not tell anyone. The responsibility for navigation falls to Orath 7. She said his name and he stopped. She reached into her pocket and took out the folded message and placed it on the table between them. I want you to read the manifest. I have already reviewed the relevant data. I want you to read the names. He looked at the folded paper. The names have no bearing on the legal question. No, she said, they don't. She looked at him steadily. Read them anyway. There was a pause. Orath-7 did not move. His 4 delegation members did not move. The room had the specific silence of a moment that is deciding what it is going to be. This negotiation, he said finally, is becoming emotional rather than procedural. Dara picked up the paper and put it back in her pocket. She stood up. She pushed her chair in, which was a small and ordinary motion, and she looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not anger and was not grief and was not a warning. It was something quieter than all three and somehow more serious. "We're done talking," she said. She walked to the door. "Ambassador Osa." His voice stopped her at the threshold. "If you leave this session, the Conquered will consider the negotiation failed. The legal mechanisms." "I know what the legal mechanisms are," she said without turning around. "I helped write 3 of them." She left. Behind her, Orath-7 sat very still for a long time. He pulled up the transit manifest on his personal display. 209 entries. He looked at them. Names, ages, points of origin, destination. He read them the way he read any data, systematically, top to bottom. Halfway through the list, he found an entry that was different from the others. A child, age 4, listed under her mother's entry as dependent passenger. The child's name was a human word he did not have a translation for. He read to the end of the list. He closed the display. He sat for a long time. He did not grieve. His species did not grieve. But something happened in him that his language did not have a word for, and he sat with it in the quiet of the empty session room while outside the stars kept turning, indifferent and ancient and very far away. Word of what happened at Meridian Point moved faster than any official communication. It always did. The Conquered had hundreds of official channels and thousands of unofficial ones, and the unofficial ones were older and faster and trusted more. By the time the formal notification arrived at the Velkari Home System's diplomatic desk, every major species in the galaxy had already heard 3 versions of the story. In one version, Dara Os had thrown a chair. In another, she had delivered a prepared speech that had reduced the Velkari delegation to silence for 6 hours. In the version closest to the truth, she had put a piece of paper on a table, asked a question, and walked out when the question was not answered correctly. The Velkari government issued a statement calling humanity's withdrawal from talks irresponsible and destabilizing. They used the word emotional twice. They requested the Conquered assign a new mediator and resume proceedings within 10 days. The Human Diplomatic Office replied with a document that was 700 pages long. It had taken 4 days to produce. 6 humans and a research team of 12 had worked without sleeping more than 3 hours at a stretch to compile it. It contained every record of every interaction between human interests and Velkari automated defense systems going back 11 years, every reported incident, every filed complaint through Conquered channels, every response from the Velkari side to those complaints, which in most cases was no response, or a response citing the subclause of the old treaty, or a response that acknowledged receipt and then closed the file. The document also contained the technical specifications of Velkari defense grid weapons, cross-referenced against the hull ratings of human civilian vessels, with a section that laid out in very clear language what happened to a passenger transport when it encountered that kind of weapon at standard approach speed. This section was not graphic. It did not need to be. The physics were sufficient. The Conquered Legal Committee read the document in full. It took them 2 days. When they finished, the committee chair, a Gorath named Beld who had been in the role for 20 years, and had the slow, settled certainty of someone who had seen many bad situations and a few truly serious ones. Sent a private message to the Velkari ambassador. The message had no diplomatic softening. It said that the document was going into the formal record, and that the Velkari government had 72 hours to respond with a concrete proposal before the committee was obligated to recommend formal proceedings. The Velkari ambassador sent back a message citing the subclause of the old treaty. Beld read it and sat with it for a while. Then he made a different kind of call. The human diplomat he reached was not Dara Osai. It was a man named Femi, who was 2 levels above her in the structure of the human diplomatic service, and who had the reputation of being the calmest person in any room he entered, which in his line of work was sometimes a liability and sometimes the most frightening thing about him. Beld explained the situation. He asked what humanity intended. Femi was quiet for a moment on the other end of the call. "Tell me something," he said. "In your experience, when a party to a conflict cites a 70-year-old subclause after 209 people are dead, what does that usually mean?" Beld thought about it. "It usually means they believe the legal framework protects them from consequences." "Right," Femi said. "We're going to show them what consequences look like outside the legal framework." Beld asked him to clarify. "Not violence," Femi said, and there was something in the way he said it that made Beld notice the word "not" specifically, as though Femi was flagging it as a distinction that mattered rather than as a certainty. "We're going to make the Velkari understand what they took, not legally, actually." Beld didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. He found out over the next 3 weeks. Humanity did not mobilize a fleet. They did not issue threats or ultimatums. What they did was quieter and stranger, and, to most of the species watching, more unsettling than either of those things would have been. They published the names. All 209 of them, yes, but not as a list, as a project. A human cultural institution that normally documented exploration history took on the work. They spent 2 weeks finding every family member, friend, and colleague of every person on the manifest. They gathered recordings, voice messages, personal videos, written correspondence. They gathered photographs and descriptions and the small, ordinary objects of ordinary lives. They built an archive. They broadcast it on every Concord-accessible public channel simultaneously. It ran for 209 hours, 1 hour for each person, not eulogies, not political statements, just the actual texture of actual lives, what they had been building toward, what they had been looking forward to. The transit had been headed to a new settlement. Many of the passengers were going to build things there: a school, a water system, a medical station. Several of the people had made recordings of what they planned to do when they arrived, full of the specific practical optimism of settlers who have packed their tools and are almost at the destination. Those recordings were the ones that spread the furthest. Oreth 7 watched 40 minutes of the broadcast before his aides suggested he stop. He did not stop. He watched all 209 hours. He watched it in his private office with the door closed and did not explain to anyone why he was doing it. On the Velkari homeworld, in ordinary households, in schools and government offices and transit stations, the broadcast ran on every screen that received public channels. The Velkari did not have a word for what they were supposed to feel. They had never needed one before. That was the first thing humanity did. It was not the last. The Velkari government made a mistake on the 22nd day, and it was the kind of mistake that comes from misreading silence as weakness. They had been watching humanity's response for 3 weeks. The broadcast had run. The archive had been built. Diplomatic channels were quiet. Human ships in the Kessel Band had pulled back from all contested zones without being asked. To the Velkari Analytical Division, this pattern matched a specific behavioral profile they had on record for species that had reached their limit of action and were now waiting to be offered a face-saving exit. The humans, in their reading, were exhausted by grief and ready to accept a minor concession and return to normal relations. They sent a proposal. It offered a formal acknowledgement of the incidents, not an apology, an acknowledgement, and a one-time financial settlement calculated at standard Concord compensation rates. It also included, buried in Section 4 of the annexes, a provision that would extend Velkari legal jurisdiction over an additional stretch of the Kessel Band, framed as a navigational safety measure. Femi read the proposal for 8 minutes. Then he called his team into the room and read it aloud to them. No one said anything for a moment. Then one of the junior analysts, a young woman named Priya who had been awake for most of the previous month compiling the 700-page document, said, "They think we're done." "Yes," Femi said. "They watched 209 hours of people's lives, and they came back with Section 4 of the annexes." "Yes." Priya looked at the proposal on the screen for a long moment. "What do we do?" Femi put the proposal down on the table. "We show them what they missed." What the Velkari had missed was a thing that was difficult to see from the outside because it looked like ordinary behavior right up until it didn't. Humans, when they were hurt, did two things simultaneously that most species did not do together. They grieved loudly and they prepared quietly. The grieving was visible. The preparing was not. It was not secretive. It was simply the background state of a species that had survived a genuinely dangerous world by never fully believing the danger was over. Every human settlement above a certain size had what the official documentation called a community resilient structure. This was, in practice, a network of people who knew their neighbors, knew what was stored where, knew who had which skills, and had run enough drills together that they could shift from ordinary life to coordinated action inside of 20 minutes. This structure was not military. It was not political. It was older than both of those things. It was the organizational memory of a species that had lived through enough catastrophes to understand that the catastrophe after the current one was already coming and should be planned for. The Kessel Band had 11 human settlements within it. Femi made 11 calls. He did not order anything. He was not in a position to order anything, and even if he had been, that was not how this worked. He explained the situation. He explained what the Velkari proposal contained. He explained what Section 4 of the annexes meant for transit access to those settlements in practical terms. He asked each settlement council what they thought. Each settlement council told him what they thought in detailed and specific terms. Then those settlement councils made their own calls to every mining operation in the band, to every cargo company with routes through the zone, to the 3 scientific research stations that depended on those routes for supply runs, to the family networks that stretched between the settlements and back to Earth and a dozen other human worlds. Those family networks made their own calls. Within 5 days, every piece of Velkari economic activity that intersected with human space had been quietly identified, documented, and communicated upward to the Concord Trade Committee with a formal request for review under navigation safety laws. This was not a boycott. It was not a sanction. It was a legal filing. 1,412 separate legal filings, each one specific, each one citing exact regulations, each one signed by a named individual who had a specific and documented connection to the affected area. The Concord Trade Committee had never received 1,412 simultaneous legal filings in its history. The Velkari Economic Review, which was supposed to take 2 weeks, found 17 irregularities in the first 3 days and escalated to a full audit. Orath 7 called Femi directly. It was the first time a senior Velkari official had initiated contact with the Human Diplomatic Service since Dara had walked out of the session room. "You are coordinating this," Orath 7 said. "No," Femi said. "I made some phone calls. The people I called made some phone calls. The people they called made some phone calls." He paused. That's how we work. You are a distributed system. We prefer community, Femi said, but yes. Oreth-7 was quiet for a moment. In that quiet, Femi could hear something that he recognized as the sound a situation makes when the person on the other end is genuinely recalculating. What does your government want? Oreth-7 said. My government wants what Dara Os asked you for in that session room, Femi said. An answer that treats 209 dead people like they were worth something. Our proposal included compensation. Your proposal included Section 4 of the annexes. Femi's voice was not hard. It was the voice of someone explaining something they have already explained once and are willing to explain again because they believe understanding is possible. You cannot give us money with one hand and take territory with the other and call that an answer. We don't work that way. How do you work? Femi thought about it for a moment. We work like people who remember things, he said. We remember for a long time, and we are very patient. Oreth-7 said nothing. Read the archive again, Femi said quietly. All of it, and then tell me what Section 4 of the annexes is worth. He ended the call. In his office on the Velkari homeworld, Oreth-7 opened his display. The archive was still there in his personal files. He had not deleted it. He had not moved it. It sat in the top folder of his personal system, where he had put it 3 weeks ago when he had watched the first hour and not been able to stop. He opened it again. The rest of the galaxy was watching by now, and most of them did not know what they were watching. The species that had military traditions saw a conflict and looked for the military angle. There was no military angle. No human fleet had moved. No weapons had been deployed. The only things that had moved were words, recordings, legal documents, and phone calls between ordinary people. The military analysts wrote assessments that kept coming back with the same problem, which was that the situation did not fit any model they had for how conflicts escalated. The species with strong trade traditions saw an economic pressure campaign and looked for the financial leverage point. They found 1,412 legal filings and a trade audit and thought they understood. But the filings had not come from corporations or government bodies. They had come from individuals. The analysts who tracked these things spent 2 weeks trying to find the central coordinating body and eventually concluded there wasn't one. The humans had just talked to each other. That was the mechanism. They had just talked to each other until everyone who cared about the same thing knew about it at the same time. The Dulari, who were watchers and collectors of information, sent a team to study the human response from the outside. The team's preliminary report, filed 6 weeks into the situation, contained a section that the lead researcher had titled simply, "The Network." It described what she had found when she mapped every communication that had passed between humans in relation to the Kessel situation over the previous month. The map looked like a living thing. Connections between individuals, between families, between professional groups, between settlements, between people who had never met each other but who had mutual contacts that stretched across the galaxy. The map had no center. Every point was connected to multiple others. You could remove any single node and the network held. You could remove 100 nodes and it held. It was not organized because it did not need to be organized. It had been built by people who understood, in the way people understand things they learned before they had words for them, that the person next to you might need your help tomorrow, and you might need theirs the day after. The researcher wrote in her notes, "They do not have a community structure. They are the community structure." Oreth-7 had been reading the archive for 4 days when something shifted. He could not identify the exact moment. It was not a single recording or a single name. It was cumulative in a way that his training had not prepared him for. He had processed the archive as data. He had counted the entries, assessed the content type of each, identified the recurring emotional registers. He had done this with the systematic thoroughness that his work had always rewarded. And somewhere between the 47th hour and the 93rd, the data had stopped being data. He was watching a recording of a man named Yaw, who had been a structural engineer, and who had spent 12 minutes talking about a school he intended to build on the new settlement. Yaw had drawings. He had been excited about the drawings in the way people are excited about things they have worked on for a long time and are finally close to making real. He had a specific idea about natural light and how to position the windows so that every classroom got morning light without overheating in the afternoon. He had talked about the children who would sit in those classrooms. He had not known any of those children yet. They were future children, hypothetical children, children who would exist in a place that did not exist yet. He had been building the place for them. Oreth-7 sat with that recording for a long time. He pulled up the file on the settlement that the transport had been heading toward. The settlement existed. It had been established 6 years earlier and had a population of 4,000. The school that Yaw had been planning to build had not been built. The current children in that settlement attended classes in a converted cargo facility. The conversion had been done carefully and the facility was warm and well lit, but it was not what Yaw had drawn. Oreth-7 had never considered, before this moment, what it meant for something to remain unbuilt, because the person who intended to build it had not arrived. He went to his superior the next morning and requested a private meeting. His superior was a senior official named Rest-12, who had been in her role for 30 years and who had the particular quality of stillness that the Velkari most respected. She listened to what Oreth-7 said without interruption. He said, "I think we have been wrong." Rest-12 was quiet for a moment. In what sense? In the sense that matters. He chose his words with the care of someone who did not often say things he could not support with data. We have been treating this as a legal and territorial question. The humans have been treating it as a question about people. And I think the evidence supports that they are correct and we are not. Rest-12 looked at him for a long time. She had a reputation for being difficult to read. She also had a reputation for being fair, which in her career had sometimes meant the same thing. "What do you recommend?" she said. "We withdraw Section 4 of the annexes entirely," Oreth-7 said. "We remove the contested defense grids from the unregistered zones. We issue an apology that uses the word apology and does not contain any subclauses." He paused. "And we ask the Human Diplomatic Service what it would take to build the school." Rest-12 looked at him. "The school?" "The one in the settlement. The one the engineer was going to build." He looked at the window. Outside it was a Velkari afternoon, which was cool and pale and unremarkable. "I think we should build it, not as a settlement, as an acknowledgement that something was supposed to exist and does not exist because of what we did." Rest-12 was quiet for a while. Outside, the pale afternoon continued without urgency. "Draft it," she said. Oreth-7 left. Rest-12 stayed at her desk and thought about 30 years of work and the particular feeling of a situation that had moved from being a problem to being something that required a different kind of attention. She thought about the word apology and the subclauses that usually followed it, and the fact that Oreth-7 had specifically said without any subclauses. She thought about a school that let in morning light. She opened a new document and began to write. The proposal arrived at the Human Diplomatic Service on a Tuesday, and Femi read it 3 times before he called anyone. The first time he read it for content. The second time he read it for what was missing. The third time he read it because he wanted to be sure he was reading it correctly and not filling in gaps that weren't there with things he wanted to see. It was clean. No subclauses. No annexes with provisions buried in Section 4. The Velkari government acknowledged in direct language that the placement of unmapped defense systems in registered transit lanes had resulted in the deaths of 209 people. They used the word responsible. They proposed the removal of all contested grid installations and the filing of complete maps with the Concord Navigation Authority within 30 days. They offered a financial settlement that was higher than the standard rate. They included a separate line item, stated plainly, for the construction of a school on the Kessel settlement, to be built to specifications provided by the human engineering community, with Velkari funding and no conditions attached. At the bottom of the proposal, in a section that had no formal heading, Orath 7 had written a single additional paragraph. It was not in diplomatic language. It was in plain language. It said that he had watched the archive and that he did not have a word in his language for what the experience had been. He said that his species did not grieve in the way humans did, and that he did not know if what he had experienced watching those recordings was a version of grief or something else. He said that he believed the people on the manifest had deserved to arrive at their destination, and that this belief had not been part of his thinking before he watched the archive, and that he thought it should have been. He had signed it with his name, and below his name he had written, "I am sorry," not Velkari for sorry, human for sorry. He had looked the word up. Femi sat with the proposal for a while. Then he walked down the corridor to the office where Dara Os was working on 3 other situations simultaneously, because the Conquered had not paused its other conflicts out of courtesy while the Kessel situation ran. She was at her desk reading something, and had the look of someone who was concentrating on multiple things and had gotten good at it. He put the proposal on her desk. She picked it up and read it. He watched her face the way colleagues watch faces after long shared work, looking for the thing that can't be said out loud yet. The initial reaction before it becomes a considered position. She read the Orath 7 paragraph at the bottom twice. She looked at the words "I am sorry" in human language at the end of a Velkari official document. "Is it real?" she said. "I think so," Femi said. She was quiet for a moment. "The school." "Yes." She set the proposal down on the desk. She looked at the window. Yaw's family should be consulted about the design. They'd have his drawings. "I know," Femi had already thought about this. "I was going to reach out to them today." Dara nodded slowly. She picked up the proposal again and turned to the last page. She read the plain language paragraph one more time. "He doesn't know if it's grief," she said. "He says he doesn't have a word for it." "No. But he watched all 209 hours." "Yes." She thought about that. About a member of a species that did not grieve, sitting in an office, watching the recorded textures of 209 lives he had not known, choosing not to stop. She thought about what it took for something to get through to a mind that was not built to receive it in that way. What effort that required from the receiver. She thought about Orath 7 in that office, and the pale, unremarkable afternoon outside his window, and whatever had shifted in him somewhere between the 47th hour and the 93rd that had turned data into something else. She said, "We accept it." Femi nodded. "I'll draft the response." "Keep it short," she said. "Don't overthink them. Just accept it and move to logistics." And the paragraph at the bottom. She thought, acknowledge it, one sentence, something that says we read it and it matters. She paused. Don't use the word appreciate, it's too small. Femi went back to his office and drafted the response. It was 4 paragraphs long. The 4th paragraph said, "The paragraph you added at the end of this document was read carefully, and it is held with the same weight you gave to the writing of it." He showed it to Dara before sending. She read that line and said, "Yes, that's right." The response went out, and within 6 hours the Conquered had the signed agreement on record. The rest of the galaxy, which had been watching this situation for over a month without fully understanding what it was looking at, now had the full picture and was still not sure what to make of it. The military analysts updated their assessments and noted that humanity had resolved a 209 casualty incident without deploying a single weapon. The trade analysts noted that the economic pressure had been entirely legal and had resolved itself through a voluntary proposal from the offending party. The Dulari researcher who had been studying the human network filed a supplemental report noting that after the agreement was reached, The network had immediately and spontaneously begun organizing logistics for the school construction, including a volunteer roster of human engineers who wanted to be involved, without any request from the government. The supplemental report was titled, "They Were Already Building It." On the Velkari homeworld, Orath-7 received a message from the Human Diplomatic Service. It was the fourth paragraph. He read it several times. He had it translated 3 ways to make sure he understood it correctly. He filed it in the top folder of his personal system, next to the archive. He sat at his desk for a while. Then he opened a new document and began, slowly and carefully, to write a message to Yaw's family. He was not sure what to say. He had been trained in many things, and this was not among them. He started the message 6 times and deleted it 6 times. On the 7th attempt, he stopped trying to find the right diplomatic language and wrote instead what was true, which was that he had watched a man talk about windows and morning light, and the children who would sit in classrooms that let that light in, and that he understood now what had been taken, and that he did not have a word for that understanding, but he was going to help build the school. He sent it before he could revise it again. The reply came back in 3 days. It was from Yaw's daughter, who was 12 years old and had inherited his drawings. She said she would like to share them if that was acceptable. She said her father had talked about the windows a lot. She said she thought the school should still be built the way he designed it if that was possible. She said thank you for asking. Orath-7 read the message, and then he sat very still for a long time in the way that his species sat still, which was the way mountains were still, heavy and present and unmoved. Except that he was moved, he simply did not have a word for it yet. The school took 14 months to build, and Orath-7 attended the opening. He had not planned to. His attendance was not required and was not expected. He was not a head of state. He was a mid-level negotiator who had been on the wrong side of a bad situation and had eventually chosen to be on a different side. There was no protocol for what his presence at the opening ceremony would mean. His aides had advised against it on the grounds that it might be misread politically. He went anyway. The settlement was small, 4,000 people, which by galactic standards was not large enough to appear on most maps. It sat in a wide valley on a world that was cool and green and smelled, Orath-7 noted when he stepped off the transport, of something damp and living that he did not have a category for. He had never been to a human settlement before. He had worked in orbit, in stations, in the neutral geometry of diplomatic spaces. He had never stood on ground that humans had decided to call home. The school was not large, 1 story, wide windows on the south side, positioned exactly as the drawings had shown. The morning light came in at an angle that crossed the first row of desks and reached the back wall by midday. Orath-7 stood in the main classroom before the ceremony and watched the light move slowly across the floor. He stood there for longer than he meant to. Yaw's daughter was at the ceremony. She was 13 now, 1 year older than the girl who had sent the message about the drawings. She was small and serious, and she stood near the front of the crowd with her mother and 2 younger siblings. Orath-7 had seen her photograph in the archive, in the recording her father had made, in which she had appeared briefly at the edge of the frame, walking through a room in the background without knowing she was being recorded. After the ceremony, she came and stood near him. This took some courage, he thought, given who he was and what his government had done. She said, "Did you know what the windows were for, when you read the file originally?" "No," he said honestly, "I understood later." She nodded. She looked at the school. "He used to talk about it like it was already real," she said. "Like it existed somewhere, and we just hadn't built it yet." Orath-7 looked at the windows. The morning light was doing exactly what the drawings had promised it would do. "I think perhaps it did exist," he said. "It existed in the drawings. It existed in the way he talked about it." She thought about that. That's a strange thing for a Velkari to say. "Yes," he agreed. "I have been finding several strange things lately." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The galaxy, meanwhile, was still processing the Kessel situation and drawing conclusions. Most of the conclusions were wrong. The species with military traditions concluded that humanity had shown strategic patience and economic leverage instead of force, which was true but incomplete. The species with commercial traditions concluded that humanity had used legal mechanisms effectively, which was also true and also incomplete. The Dulari researcher, whose name was San and who had been studying humanity for 8 months by the time the school opened, filed her final report to the Zeno Society Institute. It was long and careful and cited everything. But the section people kept sharing, the part that spread through academic channels, and then out of academic channels and into ordinary conversations across a dozen species, was a single page near the end titled, "What They Actually Did." San wrote that humanity had not used force. They had not used economic pressure in any conventional sense, because conventional economic pressure was applied by organizations to create leverage. Humanity had not applied pressure. They had told a story. They had taken 209 people who had been reduced by the Velkari legal system to entries in a database, and they had made them real again. They had done this systematically and completely, and without any apparent strategic calculation, because the humans she had interviewed during her research did not describe the archive project as a strategy. They described it as something they had needed to do, something owed. She wrote, the archive was not made to change the Velkari. It was made because the people in it deserved to not be forgotten. The fact that it changed the Velkari was a consequence of what it was, not the purpose of it. This was the thing that unsettled the military analysts. This was the thing that the trade analysts had no model for. The humans had done the most powerful thing they did not by calculating its effect, but by doing what they believed was right and allowing the effect to follow. San ended her report with a paragraph that was more personal than academic. She had been trained to avoid this, but she left it in. She wrote that after 8 months of studying humanity, she had come to understand them as a species that carried its dead, not metaphorically, functionally. They built the knowledge of what they had lost into the way they lived going forward. The dead were not database entries. They were part of the ongoing calculation. What would they have built? What would they have grown? What morning light would they have let in? A species that carries its dead like that, she wrote, is not sentimental. It is something harder to argue with than a weapon. In the settlement, in the school with the south-facing windows, the first class sat down on the first morning of the first term. The teacher was young and had grown up in the settlement, and had attended classes in the converted cargo facility, and had spent years waiting for a real school. She stood at the front of the room and looked at her students, and then she looked at the light coming through the windows, and she thought about the man who had designed those windows and never got to see them. She thought, you got here after all. She opened the lesson. The light moved slowly across the floor in the way morning light always moves, unhurried, indifferent to everything that had been required for this particular morning to exist. Outside, on the cool green world that smelled of something damp and living, the settlement continued being a settlement. People went to work. Children played. Someone was building an extension on a house. Someone else was planting something in a garden that would not be ready to harvest until next year, which meant they were already planning to be here next year, which was an ordinary act of hope so common that no one who performed it ever thought to name it. The galaxy watched all of this and tried to find the lesson in it. The lesson was very simple. It had always been very simple. It was just that simple things are sometimes the hardest to see. You do not win by being stronger. You win by making people understand what was lost. And if they are capable of understanding, if there is any part of them that can receive that weight, then the understanding does the rest. Dara Osai was back at her desk in the diplomatic service building, working on 3 other situations. She had a photograph on her desk that had not been there before the Kessel situation. It was not from the archive. It was a photograph of the school, sent by the settlement's community council the morning after the opening. The windows were catching the light in the photograph exactly the way the drawings had shown. She had not met Yaw. She had never spoken to him. She knew him from an 11-line message and a 12-minute recording she had found in the archive one evening when she had been working late and had clicked on a file at random. She looked at the photograph, sometimes between meetings. It was enough.